Welcome back. This will be our second installment. I feel like I'm making podcasts or something, like I'm telling this ongoing serial story. So installment 2, we're going to talk about a poem in some detail. This is the poem that's on your syllabus, so even if you don't have your book yet, you can follow along with this one. And then in the next upcoming segment or two, I'll look at some of the poems that appear early in the Norton Anthology. And then a little later on, a poem or two by Sylvia Plath that I'll read out loud with you, just to emphasize some of the oral elements of it. I would like to talk to you about a poem it was an important piece of work for me as a young writer to discover this poem. Called Try to Praise the Mutilated World. It's by a Polish poet, still living, I believe born in the 1940s. I don't have all that right in front of me, but I would encourage you to do a Google search on this poet. His name is Adam Zagajewski. And I'm pretty confident about that pronunciation because I saw him give a poetry reading in Knoxville a few years ago and heard him say it himself. I actually got to spend a day with him and have dinner with him and some other writers from Knoxville that night. And he was a fascinating man. I'll be surprised if he doesn't win a Nobel Prize in literature someday. This poem, I'll give you just a little bit of backstory. I think often it's better to just experience the poem firsthand before you know the backstory. But for this one, maybe it's a little bit of value in advance to help you think about what resonates in this poem as you listen to it. This poem was published originally in the 1990s, to sort of some acclaim, but it really became more widely known after the 9/11 attacks in New York City. The magazine, The New Yorker, published or reprinted in the September 24th, 2001 issue, this poem in full on its back cover as a way to commemorate the losses and the tragedy of 9/11. So that'll give you some sense of the gravity of this poem. This poem brings together some of the elements of the ode, which is a poem of praise, and the elegy, which is a poem of mourning. And I think when those two elements come together in poetry, you have a very powerful effect. So I will read the poem, and then I'll discuss a few matters with you about it. And I will be asking you via discussion to chime in with your thoughts as well. Try to Praise the Mutilated World by Adam Zagajewski. Try to praise the mutilated world. Remember June's long days and wild strawberries, drops of wine, the dew, the nettles that methodically overgrow the abandoned homesteads of exiles. You must praise the mutilated world. You watched the stylish yachts and ships. One of them had a long trip ahead of it, while salty oblivion awaited others. You've seen the refugees heading nowhere. You've heard the executioners sing joyfully. You should praise the mutilated world. Remember the moments when we were together in a white room and the curtain fluttered. Return in thought to the concert where music flared. You gathered acorns in the park in autumn and leaves eddied over the earth's scars. Praise the mutilated world and the gray feather a thrush lost, and the gentle light that strays and vanishes and returns. So the first thing I'd ask you to consider is why this particular poem might have spoken to people, why it might have become even a sort of touchstone for people after 9/11, after a national tragedy, after a world tragedy. And I'll let you consider that for yourselves. I have a few questions on a handout that I've made available to you about this poem, and in preparation for reading this and the other poems of the class. I'll get to those in a moment. Reading a poem, it takes some energy, as you can tell. I'm a little bit out of breath after reading it. It takes some energy, it takes some attention, it takes some focus on the language. I hope that you'll notice that I was reading as closely as I could to the punctuation. So if you weren't following along on the page as I read this, you might rewind or it's not exactly rewind anymore, I guess, but scroll back a little and maybe just follow along as I read it. And I'm trying to follow. I don't necessarily pause at the end of a line unless there's punctuation that suggests that. I'm trying not to instill a meter or a rhythm to it, except what the language dictates. So I'm trying to avoid the sort of like metronome form that people, sing-song form that people sometimes read into poems, whether it's there or not. So always read a poem according to the punctuation. This poem is in what's called free verse, which is a somewhat recent 20th century, late 19th century development in poetry in which it doesn't rhyme. You'll notice there's no rhyme scheme, although there are some incidental rhymes in the poem or related sound effects. There isn't a rhyme scheme and there isn't a metrical pattern such as iambic pentameter, which does an unstressed, stressed, unstressed, stressed sort of pattern throughout the line. This poem doesn't have that, and so it's important not to try to insist that belong to the poem when the poet didn't write it as such. So a few things about this poem that I hope that you'll consider, and I'm on to the handout now, which is just intro to poetry and has a date on it. It begins, "Bring what you already know to the reading of poetry, including your intuitions and feelings about things." Then we can look closely at the texts and see if we find a consensus on their intentions. What do we base those on? What do we use to establish our interpretations? Reading poetry is a practice, not necessarily theoretical, that enhances itself with use. In other words, the more you do it, the better you get at it, the more confident you feel about it, and actually the more, I think, attuned to the language of poetry you become. Reading and understanding one individual poem leads to greater access to the next poem and the next, and the poetry's like a web. You never get to the end of it. You read one poem and you really like it and you think, oh, well, let me see, I might read another poem by that poet, and you might find out who influenced that poet and read a poet by that poet. And so it's like in the way that you can follow it from point to point. It's like a spider's web. I think it's fascinating. Back to the text, you might think of poems as puzzles or riddles, in that the good ones don't easily give up their meanings, except poems have a larger goal, which is to generate and expand feeling and perspective. That's what keeps poems from being games or puzzles. One of my favorite quotes about poetry is from the Russian poet Joseph Brodsky. He won a Nobel Prize back in the 90s. He died somewhat young. He was exiled from the Soviet Union for his political views and also for his artistic practices. He was very much a poet of freedom and the freedom of the individual. His quote is, "Poetry is accelerated thinking." Now, I love that idea because I think that it captures something essential about the reading of a poem, which is you have to bring your full attention to it. You have to really be keeping up to follow the language, the meaning, the connotations through a poem, right? So accelerated thinking. In other words, you have to be on your toes. Your mind does anyway. You can be lying in a comfy chair, that's fine. But your mind has to be very sharp, and you have to bring your full attention to reading a poem. You can't really read those and get them if you're also like surfing, the baseball scores or the weather forecast or your Facebook page. So you bring your full attention. I would like to add something to Brodsky's quote. I feel like it gets half of poetry, accelerated thinking. I would add to that poetry is amplified feeling. It is feeling made large. It's feeling broadcast out. And I think that the really great poems, the poems that we'll be talking about, the poems that you probably already know and love, what they do best is they bring together those two elements of thinking and feeling to the extent that they are ever separate. They are in poetry brought very closely together so that thinking and feeling are really one and the same process. And so accelerated thinking, amplified feeling. Now, specifically about the Zagajewski poem, I've got a few questions on here that I hope you'll spend some time considering. What does the repetition, in other words, the refrain, so I'm already going to introduce some terminology. This is a course in which you'll need to know some terminology. A refrain is words repeated at intervals throughout a poem, often to indicate a theme, and sometimes with a different meaning or connotation with each appearance. It's common in popular songs and folk tales. For my definitions, I will use the glossary of our book, our Norton anthology. Don't miss this, actually, it's very, very helpful. Has a short glossary of terms, of poetic terms in the back. Now, many of my terms will come from that. For certain other definitions like that, I will use the Handbook to Literature, edited by C. Hugh Holman, Holman, and William Harmon. I have an old edition from when I was an undergraduate. You can find these readily available on the internet or in libraries. If you are an English major, or even just a serious, long-time reader of literature, I would encourage you to invest in a used copy of this. You can find them for practically nothing. And it's a great resource for a term like refrain, which you've probably heard before, right? You probably know this term, but if you're unsure, knowing it in the literary context is very helpful. So my question was, what does the repetition or the refrain of that repeated line, which is also the title, what does that contribute to the poem? And why does the poet alter it each time? Now, to me, that's a key question. He doesn't just say the same thing every time. He makes a slight alteration to it. And in that slight alteration, there is a subtle change in meaning. There is a subtle change in tone for the poem. One of the early chapters in our Norton anthology is on tone, T-O-N-E. It's like the tone of, think of tone in poetry as you would tone of voice. Most of us become attuned very early on to reading tone. When we're a child, we interpret the tone of our parents or guardians or teachers or siblings. Right away, usually, we become very good at this just through necessity. You need to know when you walk into a room if people are happy or sad. You need to know if you're what kind of mood your mom is before she drives you to school if you're in kindergarten. And in every situation, this also applies to poetry. We want to be able to interpret the tone of a poem. We'll go into that in a little bit more detail later, but I want you to think about it as it applies to this particular piece. So a second question then, what kind of memories does this poem call back to? In lines 1 through 5, we get a positive tone, a tone of, it talks about life and growth, sweetness, generally good feelings, right, in the first part of the poem. And then, why do you think he counters this in the next 6 to 8 lines with phrases like salty oblivion. That means the ship has sank, right? The oblivion is the bottom of the sea. Why introduce that? Why introduce the refugees and the executioner and people who are in strife and turmoil and whose lives have been destroyed or turned upside down? I want you to think about what kind of complication those lines enter into the poem or introduce into the poem. In spite of the tragic nature of human existence, this poem seems to suggest, we must still celebrate life. Often the small details, such as a curtain fluttering, the wild fruit which grows out of the ground, unbidden. I just spent some time at my parents' farm up in Union County in Tennessee, and raspberries and blackberries are just coming ripe, and I ate handfuls of these straight off the vine, and they were delicious, and there's nothing quite like them. And it was a reminder of, in reading this poem again, and the wild strawberries that just grow out of the ground, not even planted, that there is a sweetness to life, there is a goodness to the earth, that this poem seems to be invested in. And that it seems to say to its readers that you must recognize the goodness of the earth. If you are to accept that tragic nature of life, the only way to do that is to acknowledge the goodness in life. So this highlights the paradox, Paradox, at the heart of the poem. And that is at the heart of so much good poetry. The world, people, our own lives are neither all good nor all bad, but encompass a range of qualities and experiences, some of which, now paradox is very simple. The simplest definition I know is it's a seeming contradiction. It's when two things don't appear to go together and yet somehow they can go together. They don't have to, but they can. So in this poem, that the light returns after vanishing in the final line is a key image, as well as the key to the poem's meaning, and that the light can come back after being extinguished, after being, after vanishing. That's part of the paradox. That's part of what makes the beauty of this poem, is that the light can return. The light does return. And I would give you just a couple more thoughts about this poem. If you notice how it moves through sweetness, and then it moves into poverty and exile, and then inequity, and then cruelty, and then about remember the moments. We get into personal joy and subtlety. We get into memory of gathering acorns, and then the gray feather. These are the gray feather, the gentle light. These are the smallest things in the world, but we can take some joy in one feather off one bird, and being able to find that, being able to find the beauty in that. I hope that when you read the poem later in the term, Dover Beach by Matthew Arnold, that you will think back to this particular poem by Adam Zagajewski. And that poem was written, about 150 years earlier than this poem. And yet I think they have a lot in common. And I think you'll notice certain threads, certain themes, even certain feelings that poems share across great expanses of time. And one of the beauties of poetry that I hope that you'll take away from this class is that poetry creates this community across time and across place, from different parts of the world and from different periods in history. There can be a common thread. So this will be the end of part 2 of section 2. When we come back, we'll talk about some more poems from the Norton anthology. So see you in a moment.